On May 17, 1989, people poured into the streets of Beijing, joining a student movement against the government. People came from all parts of the country and walks of life. The people walked together, workers amongst students, young amongst the elderly, police amongst officials, all coming to protest 40 years of oppression and bringing forth a large number of varying demands. With over 1 million people, the movement seemed unstoppable. Pressure for immediate action fell on the shoulders of paramount leader of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, Deng Xiaoping. That evening, Deng Xiaoping announced the abandonment of negotiations and announced the implementation of martial law. In 1989, Chinese Premier Leader Li Peng issued orders instructing the People's Army to fire on students and workers in Tiananmen Square who were calling for democratic reform through a massive public protest. This use of force ended the movement and was a turning point that delayed many emerging political and social reforms, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, implementation of a multi-party system, and led to the expulsion of reformers and moderates from the CCP, leading to a greater international isolation for the Chinese. By 1978, China was already on the road to reform. The third plenum of the 11th Communist Party Congress imposed counterproductive political and economic reforms that added to growing discontent and fueled the 1989 protests. These reforms attempted to gradually implement a free market economy. Students had few opportunities to actually get a job in the field of their expertise because the new economic reforms brought an end to state-assigned positions in private businesses, allowing owners to hire based on favoritism and nepotism. Students and intellectuals alike were left idle, leading to an increased interest in political issues, which were discussed in small study groups that began to appear on university campuses in Beijing. Government price controls and manipulation by insiders caused instability and resentment. Severe inflation jeopardized the ability of salaried workers to buy staple goods. State enterprises were forced to cut costs, threatening job security and social benefits for a large portion of the population. The unfair distribution of wealth brought the workers into the movement. Small student protests escalated to a point in which Deng Xiaoping felt his only option was to impose martial law. In 1986, Professor Fang Lizi returned from Princeton University and spoke with students about Western ideas like human rights, separation of powers, capitalism, and the two-party system at several universities. These ideas, along with democratic reformist movements in other countries such as the Soviet Union, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and South Korea, inspired widespread student protests that caught the attention of Central Chinese leadership. General Secretary Hu Yaobang, a popular progressive among students and intellectuals, was put in charge of cracking down on the protests. However, his sympathetic approach was criticized by party conservatives who feared he was undermining stability. His views were thoroughly denounced and he was forced into resignation in 1987, ending the first set of student protests. However, protests were sparked again on a much larger scale, April 15, 1989, shortly after Hu Yaobang's death. This event resulted in over 100,000 students gathering in Tiananmen Square to commemorate Hu and his legacy. This large-scale commemoration quickly transformed into a movement when students created a list of reforms known as the 7 Demands that were closely intertwined with the beliefs of Hu. The students demanded that the government endorse Hu's view on democracy, confess that their anti-liberalization campaigns were wrong, become financially transparent, end press censorship, increase educational funding and opportunities for intellectuals, allow the right of peaceful assembly, and provide unbiased coverage of the protests. However, the government did just the opposite. Hardliner Premier Li Peng issued an April 26th editorial in the People's Daily that labeled the protests as a conspiracy to overthrow the CCP in an attempt to scare the students into submission. The students felt antagonized rather than fearful. 100,000 of them marched to Tiananmen Square and convinced the government to engage in negotiations. It was now General Secretary Zhao Ziyang's turn to deal with the students. Zhao took a very different approach. He gave 2 sympathetic speeches and believed the best course of action was through negotiation. Zhao's approach demonstrated a split within the Communist Party. Hardliner conservatives mounted behind Li Peng and spoke against the student protests, while those who promoted democracy and transparency supported Zhao Ziyang, calling for further negotiations. However, radical leaders such as Wang and Wu Kaizi believed these negotiations were a way to coerce the students into ending the protest. These leaders organized the first hunger strikes on May 13th that would disrupt the visit of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, giving the student movement more leverage. Gorbachev's welcome at the square was simply cancelled, and once he arrived, negotiations with students took place. Many CCP moderates joined the hardliners after seeing the protests transform Gorbachev's visit into an ordeal. Foreign journalists surrounding Gorbachev's visit brought the protests international publicity. This publicity strengthened the movement. People from over 400 cities in China traveled to Beijing. Now, with both national and international pressure to take action, Deng called for the use of martial law on May 20th. The government was greatly humiliated when the People's Liberation Army was overwhelmed by protesters and turned back in defeat. They lashed back, sending troops in from 4 directions. On June 3rd, shots were fired indiscriminately, and people put up barricades and burned vehicles to prevent the army's advance on the square. At about 4:30 a.m., the army had forced their way into the square with tanks, and by 5:40 the square was clear. The following morning, parents of students attempted to converge on the square.
These parents were running back and forth, and they were saying, "Want to go into the square, looking for our children." Then an officer came out with a loud hailer, and he said, "I'm going to count to 5, and then we're going to fire." And a lot of people went down. 30, 40, 50 people are knocked down. Everybody else ran away. I'm lying in the grass thinking, this is the worst thing ever. This is hell.
Estimates of deaths range from 180 to 3,000 casualties. Protests had not completely ended, but they were rapidly declining as other major cities began to crack down. Immediately following the crackdown, the events were strongly criticized by international powers, and the Chinese government took decisive action to ensure that this movement would not be remembered. The CCP knew well that their actions had been unlawful and ordered tens of thousands of arrests and uncounted numbers of executions to reduce eyewitness accounts of the incident. Workers suffered the worst sentences, for many of them did not have strong connections to the government. Many students were barred from participation in politics, and numerous student leaders fled the country. Those not in favor of martial law were purged from the CCP, such as Zhao Ziyang, Hu Zili, and many other party members. In fact, party power became more centralized as positions such as General Secretary, President, and Central Military Commission Chairman were consolidated into one position. In addition, the CCP reaffirmed strict control over the press, publishing, and mass media, returning to the rigid censorship present in the 1980s. As a result, many state reporters were removed for their sympathetic reporting during the protests, and a small period of press freedom ended just as quickly as it had begun. In the long run, the Tiananmen Square crackdown shifted party objectives, hurt international relations, and highlighted Chinese human rights. After the crackdown, many socialist hardliners gained power, and Deng, as a result, lost influence and turned his attention towards economic reforms that have helped Beijing become the great metropolis it is today. However, after the crackdown, numerous countries temporarily suspended foreign loans to China, and the United States and Europe placed arms embargoes on China that still remain today. China was now seen as a repressive authoritarian dictatorship, including Hong Kongers now viewing the CCP as untrustworthy and leading to large migrations of Hong Kong people to Western countries. This event also brought great international attention to Chinese human rights.
No other country raised the issue about human rights in China. But after 1989, although the situation changed a lot comparing, to Cultural Revolution, but the world, posed high pressure on human rights situation in China.
In addition, the severe censorship imposed after the crackdown still remains in place today. Internet and media coverage of the event is blocked. The government continues to dictate how events should be reported on. Jiang and Hu still maintain that censorship is necessary to secure the stability required for economic success. Overall, the student protests of 1989 led to the implementation of martial law, a turning point that delayed emerging social and political reforms in China. The use of force led to a great purge of reformists and intellectuals, resulting in centralized power and greater international isolation. Students in 1989 managed to mobilize vast public support, and although they suffered a brutal crackdown, they managed to capture the attention of the world, forever instilling their ideas of political reform and human rights in the minds of Chinese citizens and the rest of the world.